My son opened the package and froze. Not the kind of freeze when you're surprised by something good. The kind where your body knows danger before your brain catches up. He was holding this old leather journal, staring at the inside cover like it had personally threatened him. And then he whispered, "Mommy, what is this?" His voice was so small, so confused, with this tremor that made my stomach clench. I should have trusted that instinct. I should have known they'd eventually come for him too. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense without context. It was a Saturday morning in October. One of those perfect fall days where the air smells like possibility and everything feels manageable. The kind of morning that makes you believe you've got this whole parenting thing figured out. My husband Mark was at his weekend job at the hardware store, pulling extra shifts to save for Jake's college fund. Jake was in his pajamas building some elaborate castle out of couch cushions, complete with a moat made from throw pillows and a drawbridge constructed from his wooden blocks. I was actually succeeding at being the kind of mom who makes pancakes from scratch instead of opening a box of frozen ones. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and butter. Jake was humming some song he'd learned at school, and for once, everything felt exactly as it should. Peaceful. Normal. Safe. The doorbell rang around 10 a.m. Sharp, insistent. I wasn't expecting anything. No Amazon deliveries, no grocery orders, nothing scheduled. Jake bounced to the window like he always does, pressing his face against the glass with such enthusiasm that his breath fogged up the pane. "There's a big truck, Mommy. Someone sent us something." He was practically vibrating with excitement. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to look. The UPS truck was already pulling away, and there on our porch was this brown package. Medium-sized, maybe the dimensions of a small shoebox, but heavier looking. A little beat up around the edges, like it had traveled a long way or been handled roughly. I brought it inside and set it on our kitchen table, right next to Jake's half-finished waffle that was slowly getting cold, and the art project he'd abandoned mid-creation. Some elaborate drawing involving dinosaurs and rainbows that he'd been working on for 3 days. The return address made my stomach drop just a little. It was my parents' address. The house I grew up in a town I hadn't visited in 8 years. I hadn't spoken to them in 8 years. Jake had never even met them. He doesn't know they exist, and I had planned to keep it that way. There were reasons for that distance, reasons I'd never fully explained to Mark, reasons that felt too complicated and painful to unpack. But seeing their address in my mother's familiar handwriting brought all of it rushing back. But Jake's eyes lit up the way they do when he gets mail. This kid treats every package like Christmas morning and every birthday rolled into one. He could get excited about junk mail if it had his name on it. The fact that this was an actual package, with actual weight and mystery, was almost too much for his 7-year-old brain to handle. "Can I open it, Mommy? Please? Pretty please." He was doing that little bounce he does when he's trying to contain his excitement. His hands were already reaching for it, fingers twitching with anticipation. And, honestly, I was curious too. What could they possibly be sending after 8 years of complete silence? What would possess them to reach out now, through Jake, rather than trying to contact me directly? I found scissors and cut through the shipping tape. The box wasn't heavily sealed, just folded closed in that standard cardboard box way. Jake opened it carefully, the way I taught him. He's learned to savor the unwrapping process, to make it last. Inside was tissue paper, white and crisp, wrapped around something rectangular. The kind of tissue paper that expensive stores use, not the cheap stuff from the dollar store. He peeled it back slowly, his little fingers working with the concentration of a surgeon. And there it was. An old leather journal. The kind with a brass clasp and that worn, vintage look that you can't fake. The leather was a deep brown, soft from age and handling, with natural creases and variations that spoke of years of use. The brass hardware had that perfect patina that only comes from time, not the artificial aging they do in factories. "It's like a diary," Jake said, running his fingers over the cover with reverence. But for boys. He was right. It was masculine, sturdy, sophisticated. Beautiful, actually. The kind of thing you'd find in an expensive antique shop and pay too much for because you couldn't resist the craftsmanship and history. The leather felt warm under my fingers when I touched it. Substantial. This wasn't some cheap notebook dressed up to look vintage. This was the real thing. Old, well-made, probably worth more than I wanted to think about. Why would my parents spend this kind of money on a gift for a grandson they'd never met? Jake opened the brass clasp. It clicked with that satisfying sound old hardware makes, the kind of sound that speaks of quality and care in construction. The pages inside were thick, cream-colored paper with that slight texture that comes from traditional papermaking. Some of the pages had writing on them, faded ink in different handwritings. And that's when he saw it. The inside front cover had writing. Careful script in black ink, the kind of handwriting that takes time and attention. Perfect penmanship that my mother had drilled into both of us as children. For Tommy, it read, "May your dreams come true. Love, Grandma and Grandpa." Jake stared at it for a long moment. His brow furrowed the way it does when he's trying to solve a math problem that's just a little too hard for him. The same expression he gets when he's reading and comes across a word he doesn't recognize. He traced the letters with his finger, sounding out the name. "But I'm Jake," he said quietly. "Not Tommy." He looked up at me with those big brown eyes that are so much like mine, so much like Mark's, but also somehow like eyes I remembered from long ago. Did they make a mistake? Who's Tommy? Do they have another grandson? The world stopped. Not gradually, not like a slow realization creeping in. Just stopped. Cold. Complete. Like someone had hit a pause button on reality. Because Tommy was my twin brother. And Tommy died when we were 8 years old. My hands started shaking before my brain even processed what I was seeing. The fine tremor that starts in your fingers and works its way up your arms, making your whole body feel unstable. Jake was still holding the journal, still waiting for an answer that I couldn't give because my throat had closed up and my lungs had forgotten how to work. I reached for the journal with hands that felt disconnected from my body. And that's when I saw them. Photos. Old photographs tucked into the pages, slipped between the cream-colored paper like bookmarks. I pulled them out with trembling fingers that could barely grip properly. The first one showed a boy who looked exactly like Jake. Same dark hair that cowlicks in the back, same brown eyes, same smile that's a little crooked on the left side. But it wasn't Jake. The photo was old, faded around the edges with that slightly yellowed quality that comes from age. The clothing was from the 90s. The date stamp in the corner, small and precise, said 2002. 22 years ago. "Mommy?" Jake's voice seemed to come from far away, like he was speaking from another room even though he was right beside me. "You look scared. What's wrong? Why are you shaking?" His voice had that worried quality children get when they sense their parents' distress, but don't understand the cause. I took the journal gently from his hands, trying to keep my expression neutral even though everything inside me was screaming. There were more photos inside. Different ages. The boy in the pictures growing up, year by year. 9 years old, 10, 11, 12. All taken after Tommy was supposed to be dead. All showing my brother living and growing and existing in places I'd never seen, with people I didn't recognize. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound that made Jake jump. "Go watch cartoons, baby," I managed to say. My voice sounded normal somehow, even though everything inside me was screaming. Muscle memory, I suppose. The ability to put on the mom voice even when your world is collapsing. "Mommy needs to look at something." Jake hesitated, sensing something was wrong in that way children do. His eyes searched my face, looking for clues about what had changed so suddenly. But he's a good kid. He trusts me. He knows that sometimes adults need space to handle grown-up things. He went to the living room, but I could feel him glancing back at me with concern. I sat back down and spread the photos on the table with hands that were still shaking. 7 pictures total. Tommy at different stages of growing up. In places I'd never seen. A different house with different furniture. A backyard I'd never played in. With people I didn't recognize, adults who were smiling at him, children who seemed to be friends or maybe siblings. If you're already feeling the chills, hit that subscribe button because what I discovered next will blow your mind. And if you're one of those people who watches till the end without subscribing, drop a comment telling me why. I genuinely want to know what it takes to earn your subscription. I need to explain about Tommy. About what happened when we were 8. Or what I thought happened. Because for 22 years, I've lived with the guilt of being the twin who survived. For 22 years, I've carried the weight of his death like a stone in my chest. Every birthday, every milestone, every moment of happiness shadowed by the knowledge that he should have been there too. And now I'm looking at photos that prove everything I believed was a lie. We were 8 years old, Tommy and I, unidentical twins. We had different temperaments, different ways of moving through the world. I was the cautious one, the rule follower, the child who colored inside the lines and always remembered to raise her hand before speaking. Tommy was different. Not bad, just intense. He felt everything more deeply than I did. When he was happy, he was radiant, spinning in circles and laughing so hard he'd fall down. When he was scared, he was terrified, hiding under blankets and refusing to come out until someone sat with him. When he was angry, the whole world knew it. He had meltdowns that could last for hours. Looking back now, with adult eyes and knowledge about childhood trauma and anxiety disorders, I can see what I couldn't then. Tommy wasn't difficult. He wasn't defiant or spoiled or attention-seeking. He was traumatized. Something had happened to him, or was happening to him, that made the world feel dangerous and unpredictable. He had nightmares that would wake the whole house. Terrible dreams that left him screaming and crying and unable to be comforted. He couldn't sleep alone. Even at 8 years old, he'd creep into my room in the middle of the night, curling up on the floor next to my bed like a dog seeking protection. He'd cling to me or our parents like we might disappear if he let go. Going to school was a daily battle. He'd wrap his arms around Mom's leg and beg her not to leave him. Teachers complained that he was disruptive, that he couldn't sit still, that he cried too easily and too often. He was afraid of everything. Loud noises would send him into a panic. Strangers made him hide behind whoever was nearest. Being left alone, even for a few minutes, would trigger anxiety attacks that left him hyperventilating and inconsolable. Our parents called it behavioral problems. They took him to doctors, therapists, child psychologists. They tried medications that made him drowsy and disconnected. They tried behavior charts and reward systems and consequences that never seemed to work. Nothing seemed to help. Tommy just got more anxious, more clingy, more afraid. And I was the easy twin. The one who slept through the night without nightmares. The one who could be left with babysitters without a 3-hour meltdown. The one who didn't cry when Mom went to the grocery store or when Dad worked late. I was the child who made our parents feel successful while Tommy made them feel like failures. I remember the constant tension in our house. The way conversations would stop when Tommy entered the room. The way our parents would exchange looks over his head, tired, frustrated, hopeless looks that said they didn't know what else to try. The way they'd speak about him in whispers when they thought we were asleep. "He's getting worse," I heard Mom say to Dad one night. "The therapist says he might need residential treatment. Specialized help." "We can't afford that," Dad replied. "And besides, what about Sarah? She needs stability too. She needs parents who aren't exhausted all the time." I didn't understand then what they were discussing. Now I realize they were talking about sending Tommy away. The camping trip was supposed to be a family bonding experience. Dad had read some article in a parenting magazine about how nature helps anxious children. How being away from the distractions and pressures of daily life could help families reconnect and heal. It sounded good in theory. We went to this lake about 2 hours from home. Beautiful place, surrounded by tall pine trees, with hiking trails and a little beach area where families could swim and picnic. The kind of place that should have been relaxing and restorative. Tommy hated it immediately. He didn't want to sleep in the tent. The sounds of the forest at night, owls hooting, branches creaking, small animals rustling through the underbrush, sent him into a panic. He didn't want to go near the water. Even the shallow areas where other children were playing happily seemed dangerous to him. He spent the first day pressed against Mom's side, jumping at every bird call, every unexpected sound. When other families tried to include him in games or activities, he'd hide behind her legs. Other parents gave us those looks, the pitying, judgmental looks that said we clearly didn't know how to handle our own child. By the second day, even I was getting frustrated with him. I wanted to explore, to swim, to make friends with the other kids. But everything revolved around keeping Tommy calm. We couldn't go on hikes because he was afraid of getting lost. We couldn't swim because he was terrified of the water. We couldn't even sit around the campfire because the crackling and popping of burning would made him anxious. Dad was losing patience. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he'd clench his hands when Tommy would start crying over something that seemed trivial. "He's ruining it for everyone," he muttered to Mom when he thought we couldn't hear. "We can't do anything because of him." The storm hit on our third night. Not unusual for the area, Dad said. Summer thunderstorms were common in the mountains. But for Tommy, it might as well have been the end of the world. The thunder sent him into a panic attack unlike anything I'd ever seen. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air like he was drowning, crying so hard he couldn't speak. His whole body was shaking, and he kept saying, "I want to go home, I want to go home," over and over like a prayer. Mom tried to comfort him, but nothing worked. Dad was pacing the tent, getting angrier by the minute. "This is ridiculous," Dad snapped. "He's 8 years old, not a baby. He needs to learn to handle things." "He's scared," Mom said, but her voice was strained. She was exhausted. We all were. "Maybe we should just pack up and go home. We're not cutting the trip short because he can't handle a little thunder," Dad said firmly. "He needs to toughen up." That's when Tommy ran. Right out into the storm, in his pajamas and bare feet. Just bolted from the tent like he was running for his life. I remember chasing after him, calling his name, but it was so dark and the rain was so heavy that I could barely see 3 feet in front of me. Dad caught up with me about 50 yards from the campsite and dragged me back. "Stay here with your mother," he ordered, his voice sharp with anger and fear. "I'll find him." He grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the darkness. The search lasted 3 days. Park rangers, volunteers, search and rescue teams, even a helicopter with infrared equipment. They found Tommy's pajama top caught on a branch near the river. The water was high from the storm, moving fast and dangerous. He must have fallen in, the lead ranger told us. The current would have carried him downstream. They searched for miles, checked every bend in the river, every place where a body might have washed up or gotten caught. They brought in divers, used boats with sonar equipment, had volunteers walking the banks for hours. Never found a body. Never found any other trace of him. After a week, they called off the search. "Sometimes the river doesn't give them back," the ranger told us, his voice gentle but final. "Especially children. The current can carry them for miles, and the water's deep in some places. Could be years before." I remember my mom collapsing when he said it. Like her strings had been cut. She just folded in on herself, making sounds I'd never heard a human make before. Keening, wailing sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Dad just stood there, stone-faced, nodding like this was the outcome he'd expected all along. Like Tommy had been heading toward this ending from the moment he was born, and we'd all just been waiting for it to happen. We went home without Tommy. The drive felt endless. I kept expecting him to be there when we walked in the door, like this had all been some terrible mistake. Like he'd somehow made it home ahead of us and would be waiting in our room, maybe hiding under his bed the way he did when he was scared. I remember walking into his bedroom and seeing his bed, still unmade from the morning we left for camping. His stuffed elephant on the pillow. His books on the nightstand. His clothes in the hamper. Everything waiting for him to come back. Everything exactly as he'd left it. Mom closed the door and we never went in there again. She said it was too painful, that seeing his things made it harder to accept that he was gone. Eventually, Dad packed everything up and donated it all to charity. "He's not coming back," he said when I protested. "Keeping his things won't bring him back." The funeral was surreal. How do you have a funeral for someone you never found? There was a small casket, but it was empty except for some of Tommy's things that hadn't been donated yet. His favorite book. A drawing he'd made of our family, stick figures with huge smiles, holding hands under a rainbow. That stuffed elephant that had been his comfort object since he was a toddler. I sat in the front row wearing a black dress that itched, listening to people talk about my brother like he was already a distant memory instead of half of me. They said he was at peace now. They said he was in a better place. They said God needed another angel. But I knew the truth, even at 8 years old. Tommy hadn't gone to a better place. He died afraid and alone in the dark, swept away by water that was too strong and too cold. He died thinking we hadn't tried hard enough to find him, or maybe thinking we were glad he was gone because he'd been so much trouble. The guilt started immediately. Why didn't I grab him when he ran from the tent? Why didn't I hold onto his hand? Why didn't I follow him instead of letting Dad drag me back? Why was I the twin who lived when Tommy was the one who needed protection more? These questions ate at me for years. They shaped everything about who I became. Cautious to the point of paralysis. Overprotective in every relationship. Afraid to take risks or let people get too close, because what if I lost them too? What if I failed to protect them the way I'd failed to protect Tommy? We moved 3 times in the next 5 years. Dad said we needed fresh starts. New schools where nobody knew about the twin sister who'd lost her brother. New neighbors who wouldn't look at me with pity. New therapists who might finally help me move on. I spent my teenage years explaining why I was sad, why I had anxiety, why I sometimes talked about my dead twin like he was still alive. The guilt was like a weight I carried everywhere, invisible to others but constant for me. It affected my sleep, my appetite, my ability to concentrate in school. When I met Mark in college, it took me 2 years to tell him about Tommy. When we decided to have children, I was terrified something would happen to them too. When Jake was born, I barely slept for the first year, checking on him constantly, convinced he would disappear if I wasn't vigilant enough. I installed monitors in his room that tracked his breathing and heart rate. I kept a baby gate at the top of the stairs long after he was old enough to navigate them safely. I wouldn't let him swim without me right beside him. I wouldn't let him go to sleepovers or summer camps or anywhere I couldn't personally guarantee his safety. Mark thought I was being overprotective, and he was right. But how do you explain that you've already lost the most important person in your life once, and you can't survive doing it again? How do you make someone understand that every moment of happiness feels borrowed when you know how quickly it can all be taken away? And now I'm sitting at my kitchen table, staring at photos of Tommy growing up. Alive. Somewhere else. With someone else. Living the life I grieved for 22 years. The life I thought the river stole from him. The life I'd convinced myself was my fault for not being a better sister, a better protector, a better twin. I picked up my phone and called my parents for the first time in 8 years. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. It rang 4 times before my mother answered, and I almost hung up. Almost decided I wasn't ready for whatever this conversation was going to reveal. Hello. Her voice was older, more fragile than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. The same voice that used to read me bedtime stories, that used to comfort me after nightmares, that used to call me her good girl when I behaved the way she wanted me to. Mom. I kept my voice steady through sheer force of will. I got your package. Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, oh. Just that. Oh. Like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to be doing. Jake found some photos in the journal. I continued, my voice getting stronger as anger began to replace shock. Photos of Tommy. Taken after he died. I emphasized the last word, making it clear that I knew what I was looking at. Those are old photos. From before. Her voice was shaking now, and I could hear her breathing getting faster. Panic. She was panicking. Someone must have mixed them up. Put them in the wrong. Mom. I interrupted her, and my voice was cold now. Ice cold. The dates are on the photos. 2005, 2008, 2011, Tommy was supposed to be dead. I let that sink in for a moment. These photos show him growing up. Alive. After you told me he drowned. More silence. Then my father's voice in the background, harsh and urgent. Who is it? Hang up. Just hang up. We don't have to, and she did. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, then tried calling back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. They'd turned off their phone. I tried 3 more times over the next hour. Always straight to voicemail. They were avoiding me, and that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't old photos accidentally mixed in with new things. This was intentional. They wanted me to find these photos. They wanted me to ask questions. But why now? After 22 years of silence, after letting me believe my brother was dead, after watching me struggle with guilt and trauma and the lifelong effects of losing my twin, why would they do this now? That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I hired a private investigator. Lisa Chin came recommended by a lawyer friend who specialized in family cases. She had 20 years of experience in missing persons, fraud investigation, and family reunification. When I called her office, her secretary said she could see me that afternoon. Lisa's office was exactly what you'd expect from a professional investigator. Clean, organized, with filing cabinets that looked like they contained 1,000 family secrets. She was a small woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She listened to my story without judgment, taking notes in neat handwriting. When I finished explaining about Tommy, about the camping trip, about the photos, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up from her notepad and said, "Cases like this, they take time. 6 to 8 weeks minimum. And there's no guarantee we'll like what we find." "What do you think happened?" I asked. "Based on your experience, what does this look like to you?" She leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. "It looks like your brother didn't die in that river. It looks like someone wanted you to believe he did. The question is who, and why, and where he's been all these years." "I need to know," I told her. "Even if it destroys everything I thought I understood about my family, about my childhood, about myself. I need to know what happened to my brother." She nodded and got to work. For the first time in 22 years, I had hope. And it was terrifying. 3 weeks into the investigation, Lisa called with the first major discovery. I was at work, trying to concentrate on quarterly reports, when my phone rang. I saw her name on the caller ID and my heart started racing. "I found him," she said without preamble. No greeting, no small talk. Just those 3 words that changed everything. "Your brother. He's alive, he's well, and he's living about 3 hours from you." The room spun. I had to grip the edge of my desk to keep from falling over. "Where?" I whispered, not trusting my voice to hold steady. "He goes by Thomas Rivera now." "Rivera was your mother's maiden name, right?" I confirmed it was, my mind racing. Why would he change his name? Why would he use our mother's maiden name if something bad had happened? He's 30 years old, works as an elementary school teacher in a town called Millbrook. Lives in a small house on Maple Street. Has social media accounts, pays taxes, owns a car. He's been living a completely normal life. Lisa paused, letting that sink in. "Sarah, your brother has been alive and well for 22 years. I couldn't speak. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what she was telling me. Tommy was alive. Tommy was 30 years old. Tommy was a teacher. Tommy had been living a normal life while I'd been grieving him for more than 2 decades. "There's more," Lisa continued. "He's not alone. He lives with a woman named Maria Rivera. Based on the age difference and the shared last name, I think she might be your mother's sister. Do you remember having an aunt named Maria?" I did remember vaguely. Maria Rivera had been at family gatherings when we were very young, but there had been some kind of falling out. A fight about money or politics or something equally stupid that adults let destroy relationships. I hadn't seen her since before Tommy and I started school. "Send me everything you have," I said, my voice stronger now. Photos, addresses, social media profiles. I need to see for myself. Within an hour, my email was full of screenshots and documents that proved Tommy was alive. His Facebook profile showed a man who looked exactly like what I'd imagined an adult Tommy would look like. My face, but stronger. More masculine. He was smiling in most of the pictures, but I could see what I'd noticed in that teenage photo from the journal. The guardedness. The careful way he held himself, like he was always ready to defend against some invisible threat. His Instagram showed pictures of his classroom, decorated with encouraging posters and student artwork. Photos of him at teacher conferences, school events, hiking trips with friends. A normal life. A good life. A life that should have included me. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to subscribe to Revenge with Nick, because the revenge I planned will restore your faith in justice. And if you're still not subscribing, comment below with your reasoning. I'm collecting data on what makes people commit. Week 5 brought the legal discoveries that made everything worse and better at the same time. Lisa had been digging through court records, insurance files, school documents, anything that might explain how a dead child could be living under a different name 3 hours away from his childhood home. "There's no death certificate for Tommy," she told me over the phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. "But there are custody transfer documents." "What does that mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. The part that had been 8 years old and confused by adult conversations. The part that remembered whispered arguments and closed-door meetings with people in suits. "It means your parents legally gave him up. Signed over custody to Maria Rivera when he was 8 years old. The same week he supposedly died in that river." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Sarah, they didn't lose Tommy in a camping accident. They abandoned him." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not just that they'd given away my brother, but that they'd let me believe it was my fault. That they'd watched me struggle with guilt and trauma and survivor syndrome for 22 years, knowing the whole time that Tommy was alive and safe. But it got worse. Lisa had found insurance records. A life insurance policy through Tommy's school, one of those accident policies they sell to parents for a few dollars a month. Most parents forget they even have them. But my parents hadn't forgotten. The policy paid out $75,000 after Tommy's death. $75,000 that my parents collected while Tommy was safe and alive with Aunt Maria. They'd filed a claim, provided statements about his accidental drowning, submitted the camping receipts and witness statements from other campers who remembered the search. "It's fraud," Lisa said bluntly. "Insurance fraud." They filed a false claim, provided fraudulent documentation, and collected money they weren't entitled to. If this had been discovered 22 years ago, they would have gone to prison. If. The key word there was if. Because who would look for a dead child? Who would question grieving parents who'd lost their son in a tragic accident? The system had trusted them, and they'd exploited that trust for financial gain. "There's more," Lisa continued. "I found records of them moving your family multiple times in the years after the camping trip. New houses, new schools, new communities where nobody knew about Tommy. They were covering their tracks." I thought about those moves, how Dad had always said they were for fresh starts. How he'd said it would be good for me to get away from the memories, to start over somewhere people didn't know about my tragedy. But now I realized they were running. Not from grief, but from the possibility of discovery. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The immediate acceptance of Tommy's death despite no body being found. The quick funeral and donation of his belongings. The multiple moves to new towns where we could start fresh. Even the way they discouraged me from talking about Tommy too much, saying it was unhealthy to dwell on the past. They hadn't been protecting me from grief. They'd been protecting themselves from exposure. Week 6 brought the phone call I was dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Lisa had made contact with Maria Rivera. With my aunt. With the woman who had raised my brother for 22 years while I thought he was dead. "She wants to talk to you," Lisa said. "But there are things you need to know first. Things about why she kept Tommy all these years. Things about what your parents told her." Maria Rivera lived in the same town as Tommy, in a modest house not far from his. She was my mother's younger sister, the aunt I barely remembered from childhood family gatherings. Lisa had approached her carefully, not wanting to cause alarm or trigger any protective instincts. According to Lisa, Maria had been keeping secrets for more than 2 decades. My parents had convinced her that I was too traumatized by Tommy's disappearance to handle the truth. They told her that I'd had a complete breakdown after the camping trip, that I was in therapy, that any contact between Tommy and me would be harmful to my mental health. They painted a picture of a fragile child who barely survived losing her twin, who had built a new life on the foundation of believing he was gone forever. They convinced Maria that revealing the truth would destroy what healing I'd managed to achieve and probably land me back in the psychiatric hospital where I'd supposedly been treated. None of it was true, of course. I'd never been hospitalized. I'd been in therapy, yes, but for grief counseling, not a psychiatric breakdown. I'd struggled with guilt and anxiety, but I'd functioned. I'd gone to school, made friends, eventually built a life. But Maria didn't know that. Meanwhile, They told Tommy something completely different. They convinced him that I chose to stay with them, that I didn't want him anymore because he was too difficult, that I was happier without him, relieved not to have to deal with his problems anymore. Imagine being 8 years old and hearing that your twin sister, your other half, your best friend and protector, had decided you were too much trouble to love. Imagine carrying that rejection for 22 years, believing that the person who was supposed to love you unconditionally had chosen to abandon you. Maria had believed them. She thought she was protecting both of us by keeping us apart. She'd taken Tommy in out of love and family obligation, but she'd maintained the separation because she thought it was what was best for everyone involved. She raised Tommy with patience and understanding that our parents had never shown. She got him therapy with specialists who understood childhood trauma. She helped him work through his anxiety and fears in a safe, supportive environment. She watched him grow from a terrified, damaged child into a confident, caring adult. But she kept their secret. Until now. Because my parents had been calling her. For months. Asking questions that made her uncomfortable. How was Tommy doing? Was he happy? Did he have a good job? Did he make decent money? Did he ever talk about wanting to reconnect with his family? Did he ever express curiosity about what had happened to me? Maria had been suspicious, but didn't want to break her promise to keep us apart. She'd given vague answers, changed the subject, tried to discourage their interest. But they'd been persistent. And then they'd started asking for my address. When they pushed her to help them contact me directly, to facilitate some kind of reunion, she finally told Tommy the truth. About where I lived, what I did for work, the fact that I had a family. She gave him the choice of what to do with that information. That's when Tommy started planning to reach out to me, even before they sent the journal. He'd been gathering courage to call me, to send a letter, to somehow bridge the gap they'd created between us. The journal arriving had simply accelerated his timeline. They're trying to manipulate both of them, Maria had told Lisa. I think they're in some kind of trouble. Financial or medical or both. They don't want a reunion because they miss them. They want it because they need them. Week 8 brought the final pieces of the puzzle. Lisa had been investigating my parents' current situation, trying to understand why they'd sent that journal after 22 years of silence. What she found explained everything and made it infinitely worse. My father had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes 3 years ago. What had started as a manageable condition had progressed to requiring insulin, specialized medication, regular doctor visits, and monitoring equipment. The medical bills were mounting steadily. My mother was showing early signs of dementia, becoming more forgetful, more confused, more dependent on my father for basic daily tasks. She'd been prescribed medications that were expensive and not fully covered by their insurance. They were facing the prospect of eventually needing specialized care. They'd blown through the insurance money years ago. $75,000 sounds like a lot, but spread over 2 decades of living expenses, bad investments, and poor financial decisions, it doesn't last. They had no savings, no retirement plan, no children to help them navigate their declining years. And that's when they started researching. Lisa found evidence of their online activity going back months. They'd been Googling both Tommy and me, looking up our addresses, researching our jobs and incomes, trying to determine our financial situations and family statuses. They knew where I lived, what Mark did for work, that we owned our home, and had been steadily employed for years. They knew about Jake, had seen photos of him on social media, knew he looked exactly like Tommy had at that age. They'd been planning this reunion for months. Not out of guilt or love or a desire to make amends for the harm they'd caused. Out of desperation and calculation and need. The journal wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a sentimental gesture from aging grandparents who wanted to connect with their grandson. It was bait. Carefully chosen, strategically deployed bait designed to trigger exactly the reaction it had gotten. They knew I'd recognize Tommy's name, knew I'd investigate, knew I'd eventually find him. They were counting on our emotions, on the overwhelming joy and relief and confusion of being reunited, to override our anger at being deceived. They thought we'd be so grateful to find each other that we'd forget to ask hard questions about why we'd been separated in the first place. They expected tears and forgiveness and a happy family reunion that would position them to ask for help with their mounting problems. They'd calculated that our guilt, his for believing I'd abandoned him, mine for believing he died because I couldn't protect him, would make us eager to make up for lost time. That we'd want to include them in our reconciliation as a way of healing old wounds. What they didn't count on was how thoroughly modern investigative techniques could uncover their decades-old lies. They didn't anticipate that we'd approach this reunion with adult caution instead of childish emotion. They underestimated how angry we'd be when we learned the truth. Lisa arranged the contact through Maria. The three of us, Lisa, Maria, and I, had a conference call to plan how to approach Tommy with the news that I was looking for him. Maria was nervous, afraid that opening these old wounds would harm Tommy somehow. He's built a good life, she said. He's happy, stable, successful. I'm worried that dredging up all this old pain will hurt him. I understood her concern. Tommy was her child now in every way that mattered. She'd raised him, protected him, helped him heal. The thought of causing him additional trauma was unbearable to her. But Lisa and I convinced her that the truth was better than continued deception. That Tommy deserved to know he had a sister who'd been looking for him, who'd never stopped loving him, who'd built her life around the hole his absence had created. Are you ready for this? Lisa asked me before she placed the call. I wasn't. Nobody could be ready for calling a brother who'd been dead for 22 years. But I nodded anyway, and she dialed the number. It rang twice before he answered. Hello. The voice was deeper than I remembered, obviously, but something about the cadence, the slight pause before speaking, was exactly the same. My twin brother. Alive. Real. On the other end of a phone line. Tommy? My voice cracked on his name, 22 years of grief and hope and love compressed into those two syllables. Silence. Long, heavy silence that stretched until I thought the call had dropped. Then, quietly, Sarah. He remembered my voice. After 22 years, through all the changes that time and distance and deception had wrought, he recognized me immediately. We both started crying at the same time. Not delicate tears, but the ugly, overwhelming sobs that come from a lifetime of grief suddenly colliding with impossible joy. The sound of two people who'd been torn apart as children and were only now realizing they were still whole. I thought you were dead, I managed to say through the tears. I thought you drowned. I thought I lost you forever. I thought you didn't want me, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I thought you chose them over me. I thought I wasn't worth keeping. And that's when we both understood the scope of what had been done to us. Not just separated, but poisoned against each other. Made to believe that our separation was somehow natural, chosen, deserved. Made to carry guilt and pain that belonged to someone else entirely. We talked for 3 hours that first call. Comparing memories, filling in gaps, trying to make sense of what had been done to us and why. Tommy's story was different from mine, but the trauma was the same. We'd both been damaged by people who were supposed to protect us. Tommy remembered the camping trip, remembered the storm, remembered running into the darkness. But he also remembered someone finding him. Not Dad. Someone else. A woman who said she was there to help him, who wrapped him in a warm blanket and put him in a car and drove him away from the lake and the search and the family that was supposedly looking for him. He woke up the next day at Aunt Maria's house, confused and terrified, asking for me and our parents. Maria told him there had been an arrangement. That our parents couldn't take care of both of us anymore. That I was staying with them because the situation was too complicated for children to understand. As the days turned to weeks, the story evolved. Maria, following our parents' script, told him that I blamed him for the family problems. That I was happier without him around. That everyone agreed it would be better if he stayed with her and started fresh. For years, he wondered what he'd done wrong. What made me choose them over him? What fundamental flaw in his character had made his own twin sister decide he wasn't worth fighting for? As he got older, he tried to contact our parents, tried to find me. But Maria always discouraged it. They've moved on, she'd tell him. Sarah has a new life. It would only hurt everyone to dig up the past. She genuinely believed she was protecting us both, following the narrative our parents had constructed to justify their actions. Tommy had grown up believing that his anxiety, his sensitivity, his childhood struggles had been so burdensome that his own family had given up on him. That narrative shaped everything about who he became. He'd chosen to work with children because he understood what it felt like to be rejected by the adults who were supposed to love you unconditionally. He specialized in working with kids who had behavioral problems, who were considered difficult or too much trouble. He got advanced training in childhood PTSD and anxiety disorders because he wanted to be the adult he'd needed when he was 8 years old and convinced he was unlovable. He turned his pain into purpose, helping other children heal the way he'd had to learn to heal. But he never stopped wondering about me. Never stopped hoping that someday I'd reach out, that I'd realize he was worth loving after all. If this reunion hit you in the feels, subscribe to Revenge with Nick for more stories of family justice. Non-subscribers, I genuinely want to understand your mindset. Drop a comment explaining what content would make you finally hit that button. We decided to meet in person. The phone call had been cathartic, but we both needed to see each other to confirm that this was real. Tommy offered to drive the 3 hours to my town, which was generous considering I was the one who'd been led to believe he was dead. I suggested we meet at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town, somewhere we could talk without interruption. I got there first and sat in my car for 20 minutes, shaking with nerves. What do you say to a brother you mourned for 22 years? How do you bridge that gap? How do you explain the life you built around his absence? Then I saw him walking across the parking lot, and it was like looking at a male version of myself. Same walk, same way of holding his shoulders, same unconscious habit of running his hand through his hair when nervous. Taller, broader, more masculine, but unmistakably my twin. My brother. Alive. We hugged for a long time in that parking lot. Neither of us could speak at first. 22 years of grief and guilt and longing all pressed into that embrace. I could feel him shaking, could hear him trying not to cry. This strong, successful man reduced to the 8-year-old boy who'd lost his sister. When we finally went inside and sat down, neither of us could manage more than a few bites of food. We were too busy staring at each other, memorizing faces we thought we'd never see again. Too busy trying to reconcile the memories of children with the reality of adults. You look exactly like I imagined you would, Tommy said finally. Like Mom, but happier. That last part hit me hard. I did look like our mother, but he was right about the happiness. I'd built a life filled with joy and love and peace. Things our mother had never seemed capable of achieving. I showed him pictures of Jake on my phone. Tommy's face lit up when he saw them. He looks exactly like you did at that age, he said softly. Like we both did. He touched the screen gently, tracing Jake's features. Can I meet him? I FaceTimed Jake right there in the restaurant. Mark was home with him, and they were building something elaborate out of Legos. Jake appeared on screen in his pajamas, hair sticking up, Lego brick in his hand. Jake, honey, I want you to meet someone very special, I said. This is your Uncle Tommy. He's my brother. Jake studied the screen with a serious, careful gaze. Hi, he said shyly, hiding behind his hair the way he does when he meets new people. Tommy knew exactly how to talk to kids. His voice became gentler, more patient. Hi, Jake. I'm your mom's twin brother. We grew up together, but we got separated for a long time. I've been wanting to meet you. Are you really my uncle? Jake asked, coming closer to the screen. I really am. Your mom and I were born on the same day, and we used to do everything together. Just like you and your mom do everything together now. Jake warmed up quickly, showing Tommy his latest Lego creation, telling him about school, asking if Uncle Tommy wanted to come over and see his room. Tommy handled it perfectly, engaging with Jake's interests, asking follow-up questions, making him feel heard and important. Watching them interact, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 22 years. Completeness. Like a part of me that had been missing was finally back where it belonged. That's when Tommy told me about Maria's recent calls from our parents. For months, they'd been asking increasingly pointed questions. How was Tommy doing financially? Was he happy in his job? Did he ever talk about wanting to reconnect with his family? Did he seem lonely or like he was missing something from his life? Maria had been suspicious of their renewed interest, but didn't want to break her promise to keep us apart. She'd given vague answers, tried to change the subject, discouraged their questions. But they'd been persistent, pressing for details about Tommy's life and circumstances. Then they'd started asking about me. Did Maria know where I lived? What I did for work? Whether I'd ever tried to contact Tommy? Whether she thought I'd be open to some kind of reunion? When they pushed her to actively help them orchestrate contact between Tommy and me, she finally told him the truth. About my address, about my family, about the fact that I'd never stopped looking for him in my own way. That's when Tommy had started planning to reach out, even before they sent the journal. They're trying to manipulate us, Tommy said quietly. Maria thinks they're in some kind of trouble. Financial or medical or both. They don't want a reunion because they miss us or feel guilty about what they did. They want it because they need us. The calculation behind the journal made perfect sense now. Get us emotional, get us focused on each other, and slip in later with requests for help. Use our joy at finding each other to override our anger at being separated in the first place. What do you want to do? I asked him. He thought for a long moment, his expression serious. I want to confront them. Together. I want them to explain why they did this to us. I want them to look us both in the eye and justify letting you think I was dead while convincing me you didn't want me. I nodded. For the first time since we were 8, Tommy and I were going to face our parents as a united front. The team they'd tried so hard to prevent by keeping us apart for 22 years. We decided to make it a surprise visit. No warning, no opportunity for them to prepare lies or excuses. Just show up at their door and demand the truth they'd been hiding for more than 2 decades. The drive to their house felt surreal. Tommy following me in his car, both of us heading toward a confrontation that had been 22 years in the making. I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure he was still there, still real, still my partner in this final accounting. Their house was exactly what I'd expected from Lisa's description. A small ranch house in a development that had seen better days. The kind of place people end up when they've run out of better options. The lawn was overgrown, and there were medical supply deliveries sitting on the porch. Oxygen tanks, mobility equipment, pill organizers. Evidence of the health problems that had driven them to reach out. We parked in the driveway and walked to the front door together. Tommy had never been to this house. They'd moved several times since giving him away. But he looked calm, determined. Ready for whatever we were about to face. I knocked on the door. No answer. I could hear movement inside, the sound of someone shuffling around, but nobody came to the door. I knocked again, louder. Finally, slow footsteps, and the door opened. My mother stood there in a bathrobe and slippers at 2 in the afternoon. She'd aged dramatically in the 8 years since I'd seen her. Her hair was completely gray, thin and unkempt. Her face was deeply lined, her skin pale and papery. Her eyes had that unfocused quality that suggested heavy medication or early dementia. She stared at me for a long moment, confusion flickering across her features like she couldn't quite place me. Then her gaze shifted to Tommy, and her entire body went rigid. Her face went completely white. All the blood drained from it in seconds, leaving her looking almost translucent. She gripped the door frame like she might collapse, her knuckles white with the strain. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh God, oh God." Then she started crying. Not sad tears. Panic tears. The kind of crying that comes from being caught in a lie so big it's about to destroy everything. "Mom." Tommy's voice was gentle but firm. He'd probably used this same tone with frightened children in his classroom. "We need to talk." She stepped back instinctively, and we followed her into a living room that smelled like medicine and despair. The furniture was old, worn, the kind of cheap stuff you buy when you're trying to stretch a dollar. Pill bottles covered the coffee table. Medical equipment took up most of one corner. Dad was in a recliner, oxygen cannula in his nose, looking older and frilier than I'd ever imagined he could become. When he saw Tommy, his face went through the same transformation as Mom's. But instead of panic, his expression showed something worse. Fear. Pure, undiluted terror. "You weren't supposed to," he started, then stopped himself. "How did you?" His voice was weaker than I remembered, strained by illness and medication. Tommy sat down across from them, calm and composed in a way that spoke of years of therapy and personal growth. How did we find each other? Is that what you're asking? What I did next is why this channel exists. Subscribe to Revenge with Nick if you believe in consequences. If you're still holding back on that subscribe button, tell me in the comments, what does it take to earn your loyalty? I remained standing, positioning myself where both of them could see me clearly. We know about the insurance money, I said without preamble. No gentle lead-in, no attempt to soften the blow. Just the truth, delivered like the weapon it was. We know Tommy didn't die in that river. We know you gave him to Maria and then collected $75,000 from his school accident policy. We know you committed insurance fraud and let me grieve a brother who wasn't dead. Mom broke down completely. Not the controlled tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone whose carefully constructed lie was falling apart. We were so young, she wailed. We didn't know what else to do. Tommy was so difficult, so demanding. We couldn't handle both of you. The doctors said he might need residential treatment, and we couldn't afford that. We thought it would be better for everyone if he went to Maria. So you faked his death? Tommy's voice remained steady, but I could see his hands shaking slightly. You let Sarah grieve for 22 years? You let her think I was dead? You let me think she didn't want me? Dad tried to interrupt, raising one shaky hand. Now wait a minute. I'm not finished, Tommy said firmly, and something in his tone made Dad shrink back. You took insurance money for a child who wasn't dead. You committed fraud. You destroyed 2 children's lives because one of them was inconvenient. And now that you're sick and broke, you want us both back. Not because you love us. Because you need us. The silence that followed was deafening. 22 years of lies and manipulation and calculated cruelty all laid bare in one devastating paragraph. That's when Dad found his voice, and what came out was worse than anything I could have imagined. She's right about one thing, he said, nodding toward Mom with bitter resignation. You were difficult. Impossible. Always crying, always afraid, always causing problems. We kept Sarah because she was manageable. We gave you away because you weren't. The honesty was brutal and somehow cleansing. No more pretense, no more manipulation. Just the ugly truth they'd been hiding for more than 2 decades. They'd kept one twin and discarded the other like he was a problem to be solved instead of a child to be loved. We tried with you, Dad continued, his voice getting stronger with anger. Doctors, therapists, medications. Nothing worked. You were going to ruin everything. Sarah's childhood, our marriage, our finances. So we made a choice. You made a choice, I said, my voice cold as ice. You chose money over your son. You chose convenience over your daughter's well-being. You chose to let me live with guilt and trauma for 22 years rather than admit what you'd done. And now? Tommy asked, leaning forward. What's the plan now? We find each other. We're so grateful for this miracle reunion that we forget to ask hard questions. We're so emotional that we agree to take care of you in your old age. Is that how you thought this would work? Mom looked up at me with those unfocused eyes, and I could see the calculation behind the tears. Even now, even caught in the biggest lie of their lives, she was trying to find an angle. We're sick, she said plaintively. We need help. We don't have anyone else. We're your parents. The word parents came out like a plea, like she expected it to carry weight it had never earned. No, Tommy said quietly, standing up from his chair. You're not. Parents don't abandon their children for being inconvenient. Parents don't fake their deaths for money. Parents don't lie for 22 years and then expect forgiveness because they need something. He walked toward the door and I followed him. Parents love their children unconditionally. They protect them, support them, help them heal from trauma instead of causing it. You did none of those things. We were almost to the door when Dad called after us, his voice stronger now angry. You can't just leave us here. We gave you life. We raised you. You owe us. Tommy turned around one more time, and his voice was steady and final. You raised Sarah out of convenience and gave me away like an unwanted pet. The fact that we survived your parenting doesn't make us grateful. It makes us strong. We left without saying goodbye, walked out of that house and drove away in convoy, leaving them with their medical equipment and their mounting bills and their complete isolation. About halfway home, Tommy pulled into a rest stop. We both got out of our cars and just stood there in the parking lot, letting it all sink in. The closure we'd never expected to have. The confirmation of what we'd suspected. The freedom of finally knowing the truth. "How do you feel?" I asked him. He thought about it for a moment. Angry. Sad. But also free. For 22 years, I've wondered what I did wrong. What made you choose them over me? Now I know it was never about me. It was about them being selfish and cruel and willing to destroy their children's lives for their own convenience. I nodded. For 22 years, I've carried guilt about not protecting you. About being the twin who survived. Now I know you didn't need protection from a river. You needed protection from them. And I couldn't give you that because I was 8 years old. We hugged again, this time without the desperate grief of our first reunion. This was a hug of solidarity, of shared purpose, of two survivors who'd found each other despite every attempt to keep them apart. But I wasn't done. Knowing the truth was one thing. Making sure there were consequences was another. Tommy and I had found each other, but that didn't erase the damage they'd done or excuse the crimes they'd committed. The next Monday, I called the insurance company that had paid out on Tommy's policy. I spoke to their fraud investigation department, provided them with all the documentation Lisa had found, and gave them Tommy's contact information so they could verify he was alive and had been living under an assumed name. The woman I spoke to was shocked. "This is one of the most elaborate cases of insurance fraud I've ever seen," she said. "Not just because of the money, but because of the psychological manipulation involved. We'll be opening a full investigation immediately." Within a week, they'd frozen my parents' remaining assets and started legal proceedings to recover the money with interest and penalties. Insurance fraud doesn't have a statute of limitations when the crime involves identity theft and falsified death claims. The total they were demanding was over $150,000. I also called their church, where they'd been members for years according to Lisa's research. I spoke to Pastor Williams, a kind man who'd known them as devoted congregants who'd tragically lost a child. I told him the whole story. How they'd abandoned one child and lied to another. How they'd committed fraud and were now trying to manipulate their way back into our lives. Pastor Williams was horrified. "I've been counseling them about their grief for years," he said, his voice heavy with betrayal. "I've prayed with them about losing their son. They've been receiving support and sympathy from our entire congregation. Sarah, they built their entire social identity in this community around being grieving parents. Within days, they were quietly asked to leave the congregation. Their source of social support and community connection vanished overnight. The people who'd brought casseroles and offered prayers suddenly understood they'd been manipulated by con artists. Tommy contacted our half-siblings, our older half-brother and half-sister from Dad's first marriage. They were in their 40s now, with families of their own, and had maintained minimal contact with our parents over the years. They'd always thought there was something suspicious about Tommy's death, something that didn't add up. Tommy told them everything. About being given away, about me being led to believe he was dead, about the insurance fraud, about the current manipulation attempt. They were disgusted and immediately cut off all contact. They also told their children, our parents' other grandchildren, why they wouldn't be seeing their grandparents anymore. Suddenly, my parents found themselves exactly where they'd left Tommy 22 years ago, abandoned, alone, with no one to turn to for help or support. The legal consequences took months to fully unfold, and Tommy and I watched each development with grim satisfaction. The insurance company pursued full repayment of the $75,000, plus 22 years of interest and substantial penalties. Civil suits were filed for emotional damages. Tommy and I both provided detailed statements about the psychological harm their actions had caused. Their house went into foreclosure when they couldn't make the payments on the restitution order. The stress of the legal proceedings accelerated my mother's dementia and worsened my father's diabetes. They were forced to move into a subsidized apartment in a different part of town, far from anyone who knew them. But the most satisfying consequence was the simplest one. They needed their children, and their children were done with them. Tommy and I had found each other despite their best efforts to keep us apart. We'd built a relationship based on truth instead of manipulation. And we'd made it crystal clear that they would have no part in our healing. The community they'd lived in for years turned against them when the truth came out. Their neighbors, who'd known them as the tragic couple who'd lost their son, learned that the tragedy was fake. Former friends who'd offered support and sympathy discovered they'd been manipulated for decades. Their reputation in the community was destroyed. People crossed the street to avoid them. Former church members who'd prayed with them about their grief felt betrayed and used. The social worker assigned to help them with their medical needs had to reassign their case because she couldn't remain objective after learning what they'd done. Tommy moved closer 6 months later. Not to the same town, but close enough for regular visits. He found a teaching position at an elementary school about an hour away, working with their special needs program. Kids who were considered difficult or challenging kids like he'd been. His reputation preceded him. Other teachers spoke about his uncanny ability to connect with troubled children, his patience with behavioral problems, his understanding of anxiety and trauma. He didn't tell them about his own childhood, but somehow they knew he'd been there. Jake adores his uncle in a way that heals something in me I didn't even know was broken. Watching them together, building Lego castles, reading stories, working on art projects, shows me what childhood should look like. What it looks like when adults respond to a child's needs with patience and understanding instead of frustration and abandonment. Tommy understands children's fears in a way most adults don't, because he lived with those fears himself for years. He's teaching Jake that being sensitive isn't a weakness, that having big emotions doesn't make you too much, and that the adults who love you will find ways to help instead of reasons to give up. Jake has started asking questions about why he's never met his other grandparents. We've decided to tell him the truth, in age-appropriate ways. That some adults make choices that hurt children, and sometimes families have to protect themselves by staying away from people who can't be trusted to treat them with love and kindness. But you found Uncle Tommy, Jake said after one of these conversations. Even when they tried to keep you apart, you found each other. He was right. And that's what mattered. Maria has become part of our chosen family too. She visits often, bringing stories about Tommy's childhood, filling in gaps in both our memories. She feels terrible about keeping us apart for so long, but I don't blame her. She was trying to protect us both based on the information she had. She couldn't have known our parents were lying. She's been like a real grandmother to Jake, the kind of grandparent who shows up with homemade cookies and patience for endless questions. She's helping him understand that families come in all shapes and sizes, that love is about choice and commitment, not just blood relations. I should have questioned their story more. She told me one afternoon while we watched Tommy teach Jake how to skip stones at the lake. But they were so convincing. And I wanted to believe that keeping you apart was protecting you both. You saved him, I told her. You gave him love and stability and therapy. You helped him become the amazing man he is today. I can't be angry about that. This is why I created Revenge with Nick, because sometimes the people who hurt us most need to face consequences. If this story moved you, prove it with that subscribe button. And for those who made it this far without subscribing, I'm genuinely curious. Comment below and tell me what I'm missing. What would make you finally commit to this channel? Your feedback shapes every story I tell. It's been over a year now since that Saturday morning when Jake opened the journal. My parents are living in that subsidized apartment, struggling with medical bills they can't afford, isolated from everyone they once knew. They call sometimes, leaving voicemails that I delete without listening to. They send cards on birthdays and holidays that go straight into the trash. The caller ID shows their new number, and I feel nothing. No anger, no sadness, no curiosity about what they might want to say. They're strangers to me now. People who once played important roles in my life, but who chose to write themselves out of the story through their own actions. Tommy feels the same way. They're not my parents, he said recently. Maria is my mother. She's the one who raised me, who loved me unconditionally, who helped me become who I am today. They're just the people who gave birth to me and then threw me away when I became inconvenient. Tommy and I talk almost every day now. Sometimes about practical things, work, Jake's school, Maria's health. Sometimes about deeper things, How to process 22 years of unnecessary trauma. How to build healthy relationships when your template for family was so damaged. How to be the parents and uncles and partners we want to be. We're still discovering things we have in common, still filling in the gaps of 22 years apart. We both became overly cautious adults. We both struggle with abandonment fears and trust issues. We both chose careers where we could help others heal from trauma. We're like puzzle pieces that finally found their match. Jake has started a journal of his own, inspired by the one that brought us together. But his journal is different. Instead of being a repository for secrets and lies, it's a place where he writes down adventures with Uncle Tommy, funny things that happen at school, dreams he has about the future. Real stories, truthful stories, built on a foundation of honesty instead of deception. Sometimes he draws pictures to go with his entries, stick figures of our family, always including Tommy now. Always showing us together, the way family should be. I'm writing about when Uncle Tommy taught me to ride my bike. He told me last week, showing me his latest entry. And about how he says being scared is okay, but being brave means doing things even when you're scared. That's Tommy all over. Teaching children that their feelings are valid, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. All the lessons he'd had to learn the hard way, being passed on to the next generation with love instead of abandonment. Mark has embraced Tommy like the brother he never had. They've bonded over sports and dad jokes and their shared devotion to Jake's happiness. Sometimes I catch them talking quietly about how to handle my ongoing healing, how to support me through the occasional flashback or moment of grief for all those lost years. I never understood why you were so protective of Jake, Mark told me one evening. I thought you were being paranoid. Now I get it. You were protecting him from the kind of people who could just throw their children away. The ripple effects of our parents' actions continue to unfold. Lisa, our private investigator, has been contacted by other families who suspect similar situations in their own lives. Apparently, what our parents did isn't as rare as we thought. The combination of insurance fraud and child abandonment, disguised as tragic accidents, has happened before. They're not criminal masterminds, Lisa explained. They're selfish people who found a way to profit from getting rid of a child they didn't want. It's more common than you'd think, especially in cases where one child has special needs or behavioral problems. That knowledge is both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it means we're not alone, that other families have survived similar betrayals. Horrifying because it means there are other children out there who've been discarded and other siblings who've been left to grieve people who aren't actually dead. Tommy has started speaking at conferences for teachers and social workers, sharing his story to help them identify signs of family manipulation and child abandonment. He doesn't use our real names, but he tells the truth about what can happen when adults prioritize their own comfort over their children's well-being. The goal isn't to make people paranoid, he told me after his first speaking engagement. It's to help professionals ask better questions. To recognize that sometimes the difficult child isn't the problem, the adults who can't handle them are. We've both been in therapy, individually and together, working through the complex trauma of our childhood separation. It's strange, grieving a relationship that should have been while simultaneously building the relationship that can be now. You're not just recovering from losing each other, our therapist explained. You're also grieving the children you were forced to be. Sarah, you became hypervigilant and guilty. Tommy, you became convinced you were unlovable. Those adaptations helped you survive, but they also cost you parts of yourselves. The healing isn't linear. Some days I wake up angry all over again. Some days Tommy struggles with the old fear that I'll decide he's too much trouble and abandon him again. But we're learning to navigate those moments together, the way twins should. Jake has become an unexpected source of wisdom in our healing process. Children see things more clearly sometimes, without all the complicated adult emotions getting in the way. Uncle Tommy, he said one day while they were building a fort, "Were you sad when you thought Mommy didn't want you anymore?" "Very sad," Tommy replied honestly. "For a very long time. But now you know she always wanted you, right? She just didn't know where you were." "That's right." "Good. Because families should stick together. And if someone tries to separate them, the family should fight to find each other again." Out of the mouths of babes. Jake had summed up our entire story in a few simple sentences. Families should stick together. And when someone tries to separate them, they should fight to find each other again. That's exactly what we did. And that's exactly why our parents' plan failed so spectacularly. They thought they could control the narrative forever, but they underestimated the power of love and truth and modern investigation techniques. They underestimated how much we'd grown and healed and become stronger than they'd ever imagined possible. Most of all, they underestimated the bond between twins. They thought they could sever it with lies and distance and time. But that bond was stronger than their manipulation. It survived 22 years of separation. It survived their attempts to poison us against each other. It survived everything they threw at it. And now it's stronger than ever. Because it's built on truth instead of lies, on choice instead of obligation, on love instead of convenience. Tommy and I chose each other over and over again, every day since we found each other. That's what real family looks like. The greatest revenge isn't hurting them back. It's building something beautiful without them. It's proving that their attempts to control us, to use us, to manipulate us into being what they needed instead of accepting who we were, all of it failed. Tommy and I found our way back to each other despite their efforts to keep us apart. We chose healing over hatred, truth over fantasy, and each other over the people who tried to convince us we were better off alone. We've created the family we should have had from the beginning. One based on choice and commitment and unconditional love. One where children are treasured for who they are, not rejected for being inconvenient. One where truth is valued over comfort, and protecting each other matters more than protecting appearances. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like if they'd chosen differently. If they'd gotten Tommy the help he needed instead of giving him away. If they'd told me the truth instead of letting me carry guilt that wasn't mine. If they'd chosen to be parents instead of choosing to be comfortable. But I don't dwell on those thoughts for long. Because the life we have now is beautiful in ways I never could have imagined. Tommy is exactly the brother I remembered him being, but stronger and wiser and healed. Jake has an uncle who adores him and understands him in ways that help him navigate his own sensitive nature. I have my twin back, my other half, my partner in navigating this complicated world. We can't change what was done to us. We can't get back the 22 years they stole from us. But we can make sure that every day going forward is built on truth and love and the kind of fierce loyalty that family should mean. Until next time, this is Revenge with Nick. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let the people who hurt you define your happiness. Sometimes the best revenge is building something so beautiful without them that their absence becomes irrelevant. Subscribe if you believe in consequences. Comment if you believe in justice. And never forget, the truth always finds a way.